This is Deuteronomy 16. While they were traveling in the wilderness, Israel observed Yahweh's feasts in camp. But once they get into the land, they'll be making a pilgrimage 3 times per year to observe Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and Sukkot. First up, Passover, verse 1. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to Yahweh your God. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to Yahweh your God of the flock and the herd in the place which Yahweh shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. You shall eat unleavened bread with it 7 days, even the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. No yeast shall be seen with you in all your borders 7 days. Neither shall any of the meat which you sacrifice the first day at evening remain all night until the morning. You may not sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates which Yahweh your God gives you, but at the place which Yahweh your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell in. There you shall sacrifice the Passover at evening, at the going down of the sun, at the season that you came out of Egypt. You shall roast and eat it in the place which Yahweh your God chooses. In the morning you shall return to your tents. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the 7th day shall be a solemn assembly to Yahweh your God. You shall do no work. Comment. Yahweh's instructions for Passover came primarily in Exodus 12. The passage we just read is a shortened version that has a couple of changes to adapt the Passover for life in the Promised Land. Verse 1, the Passover falls in the month of Abib, which was the first month of the Hebrew calendar. After the Babylonian captivity, Israel started calling their months by new names, but the name of the month at this time was Abib or Aviv. This is March or April on our calendar. Verse 2, there's a new twist. On the first Passover in Egypt, they sacrificed the Passover lamb at their homes. In the wilderness, they sacrificed it in whatever camp they happened to be. In the Promised Land, they shall travel to the one place Yahweh chooses to put his name and sacrifice it there. That place will eventually be Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified exactly on Passover in Jerusalem, which meant that while he was on the cross, thousands of Passover lambs were also being sacrificed. He was God's Passover lamb. Verse 3, starting at Passover, there shall be 7 days of unleavened bread to follow. As it says, unleavened bread is the bread of affliction. It's symbolic of affliction, of the time when they were driven out of Egypt on a moment's notice. It's a type of bread that can be prepared and eaten in haste. It represents Christ's affliction. It also reminds us of our need to drop everything immediately and follow Christ out of our present situation into the life he has for us, just like the Exodus from Egypt. It also reminds us that he's the bread we eat as we go. He's our sustenance. Verse 4, not a speck of yeast shall be found in their border for 7 days. This represents leaving the lifestyle of sin and indulgence behind, expunging our lives of sin. Verse 4 is a repeat of Exodus 12:10. Anything that's left of the lamb shall be burned before morning. There shall be no remains. This represents Christ's resurrection. Nothing was remaining of him. Now on to the second of 3 yearly pilgrimages, the Feast of Weeks. You shall count for yourselves 7 weeks. From the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain, you shall begin to count 7 weeks. You shall keep the Feast of Weeks to Yahweh your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give, according as Yahweh your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your God, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow who are among you, in the place which Yahweh your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. You shall observe to do these statutes. Comment, verse 9, it's only a 1-day observance, but it's called the Feast of Weeks because of the counting of the 7 weeks plus 1 day leading up to it. Jews call the holiday Shavuot, which means weeks. Christians call it Pentecost, which is Greek for 50th. It's the day the Holy Spirit arrived and first filled the believers in Acts chapter 2. Verses 10 and 11, everyone in the household shall travel to the place of Yahweh's name bringing an offering with them according to how Yahweh has blessed them. Verse 12, again, as during Passover they shall remember they were slaves in Egypt. Christians, we should remember at all times the disagreeable life from which Christ delivered us. We should earnestly ponder where we would be without Christ. Now on to the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, or Tents, the Feast of Ingathering, or the Feast of Final Harvest. There are so many English names, but the Hebrew name is Sukkot, which means temporary shelter. If we think of it as Sukkot, we're sticking with the original name, and it's much easier than trying to keep up with the various English translations. Sukkot lasts for a week, running from the 15th through the 21st of the 7th Hebrew month, which is September or October on our calendar. It's the final of Israel's 3 pilgrimage festivals. Yahweh commanded Israel to gather in Jerusalem, everyone in the household. They were to make temporary tents or shelters for themselves there. It commemorated the wilderness years of living in tents. Particularly, it commemorated the way Yahweh was with them during those years, carrying them and supporting them miraculously in the desert. Verse 13. You shall keep the Feast of Tents 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and from your winepress. You shall rejoice in your feast, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates. You shall keep a feast to Yahweh your God 7 days in the place which Yahweh chooses, because Yahweh your God will bless you in all your increase and in all the work of your hands, and you shall be altogether joyful. Comment, they shall be altogether joyful, because now they're in the land flowing with milk and honey, whereas they used to be on a bread and water diet in the desert. Yahweh gets the credit for bringing them rest from their affliction. Now a review of the 3 times. All 3 of them are reminders of what happened in the days of Moses. Verse 16. 3 times in a year all of your males shall appear before Yahweh your God in the place which he chooses, in the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tents. They shall not appear before Yahweh empty. Every man shall give as he is able according to Yahweh your God's blessing which he has given you. Comment, every man shall give because they're thankful for the way Yahweh delivered them from Egypt, sustained them in the desert, and brought them into the land. Now Moses switched subjects. Verse 18. You shall make judges and officers in all your gates which Yahweh your God gives you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Comment, the people will be responsible for making the judges. Quote, you shall make judges, end quote. Then it says, which Yahweh your God gives you. In other words, when they make the judges, they're simply recognizing the people that Yahweh has brought to the fore. They shall consider them to be Yahweh's representatives. Verse 19. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Comment, if the judge accepts a bribe, he'll definitely pervert justice, so he absolutely cannot accept. Verse 20. You shall follow that which is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which Yahweh your God gives you. Comment, now on to another subject. Asherah is a pagan goddess. Her worshippers set up poles or pillars as idols to represent her. Verse 21. You shall not plant for yourselves an Asherah of any kind of tree beside Yahweh your God's altar, which you shall make for yourselves. Neither shall you set up a sacred stone which Yahweh your God hates. Comment, that's the chapter. Let's remember where we came from and give thanks for where we are and where he's leading us. See you for Deuteronomy 17 at landofhavilah.net. Deuteronomy 17.